Hello and welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me as ever is Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshaw, and joining us today is Lesley Glaister. Lesley is a writer, poet, playwright, and she teaches creative writing at the University of St Andrews. Lesley is joining us today to talk about her book, Blasted Things. Welcome, Lesley. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Shall we start with what's your elevator pitch for the book Blasted Things?
I don't have an elevator pitch, but I suppose I would say that it's a book that in which I wanted to look at and explore the psychological impact of the First World War on individuals rather than the larger, more obvious implications. I'm interested in the impact of war in the tinier, softer, in the interstices of society and within people's lives, partly because of some of my own family history. And I'm interested in trauma and the different ways it can manifest itself. I'm also interested in a good story. And I like writing about the past, and I'm particularly interested in the 20s and the 30s. This one happens to be set in the early 20s, apart from a part of it which is set actually during the war.
Can I ask why now for this book? Because during the centenary there was a whole sort of raft of novels about the First World War and its aftermath, some better than others, but we're now, and I'm very aware as a scholar working in the field, beyond the centenary, and there are quite a few people who talk about war exhaustion and being a bit done with the First World War. And I'm wondering what prompted this book at this period. Were you inspired during the centenary to write it, and that's why it's appearing now, or was it something that's been with you for longer than that, and you've just chosen this is the right time for it?
First of all, I probably have terrible commercial instinct. I mean, I don't even think about it. So I wasn't like sort of situating myself in any kind of marketplace. But I actually did begin it in 2014. And I was aware that was 100 years, that was a centenary. And it was very useful to me, obviously, because there was so much research material, too much almost, on the television and everywhere in the newspapers. But I did. There was an illness in the family, a serious illness with my daughter-in-law, and I'd written about half of the book, and I started going to help care for her, and I continued writing the book, but I don't know. I wasn't really taking into account how much emotional energy it takes to write a novel, and how much emotional energy it takes to deal with serious illness. And looking after little children and so on, which is what I was doing. Happily, that's all turned out well in the end, I'm glad to say. But when I went back to look at the work that I'd done during that time, I had really written myself into a dark tunnel. And I nearly abandoned the book, in fact. But then I decided just to go back and have another look. And in fact, I deleted almost all I'd written. And because you've read it, you'll know there's a short piece, a section near the beginning when Clementine, the main character, is working as a VAD. And that was a sort of culmination of a long story set before the war began. And then I read through it, and I mean, it was okay, but I just thought, how very obvious that, somebody gets engaged just before the First World War. Oh, clearly they're going to lose their fiancé. I mean, it just all began to seem very, very tired, and I don't know whether it was just because I'd been emotionally exhausted when I was writing it or what, but when I went back to look at it again, I realised that that's not actually what I was interested in. I was interested in what happened next and where this the horrors and all the different experiences that the characters went through, where it actually took them rather than in the actual war itself. There are two reasons for this, I think. One is that a previous novel is called Little Egypt, and that's set in 1922. And one of the characters in that is called Victor, and he is a veteran of the First World War. And he walks out of that book for good reason. I never really knew where he went. It's always been a little sort of inkling that I might revisit Victor and see what he did get up to. When I tried to write Victor, who was quite upper class and a bit of a twit in a way, but a well-meaning twit. The different voice came all together, and Vincent's voice. So he sort of slithered down the social ladder, and it was just took on its own. He just roared into life really as soon as I started writing it. So that at that point the book took off again. I hadn't really realised until I was researching and writing the book that it was setting off sort of echoes for me, because my father was a Far East prisoner of war in the Second World War. That's always been something that I've been really concerned with thinking about. I did write a novel a few years ago called Easy Peasy, quite a few years ago, in which I started looking at the implications of that kind of traumatic experience, not so much on the person themselves, but on their family. And I got interested in the notion of inherited trauma. And so as I was writing Blasted Things and writing about the aftermath of the First World War, that began to play very strongly in my mind as well. And in fact, what I'm writing now is a book which takes up with the children, boy Edgar, who's born in the first book, and the baby that's about to be born at the end, girl Aida. It's about both their experiences after the Second World War. So I'm kind of leaping that far forward, and partly because I want to revisit the experience of a former Far East prisoner of war. I've been doing quite a lot more research into that now, which I'm finding both traumatizing, thinking about my dad, and just very fascinating. And it just, so much of what I'm reading now, and so much of the research that's been done subsequently about the psychological and physical effects on the prisoner themselves, but also on their families, it's just ringing so true that it's fascinating. So I hadn't realised when I started it, but I think I must have that preoccupation. And I think very often when people are writing short stories and novels, they're not so aware of where the impulse is coming from.
It does occur to me we should probably explain what the book is about, because you've introduced the two main characters, Clementine and Vincent. Do you want to give us a quick summary of the plot for our audience?
Yeah, well, Vincent, I mean, he doesn't begin the book, and in fact, Clementine is possibly the more main character, but it was Vincent who was the one, as I said, who kind of roared into life in my head. He's a man who volunteered in the First World War as an ordinary soldier. Went all the way through the war, became an NCO just because he displayed some ability, and I think by the end of the First World War, quite a few of the people who were officers were just the ones that were left. that's the. I mean, you can please correct me, but that's how I read it. That's how some of the stuff that I read. That's what made me believe. Anyway, so really, when he came out of the army at the end of the war, very damaged physically, he was expecting to be welcomed back with open arms as a hero, and he was hoping for a managerial job, or to get his foot on the ladder, but had the experience that sadly so many men had when they got back, of being really. I mean, he was disabled. He lost his job, didn't get the job he hoped for. I like Vincent because I think he's a chancer. I quite admire that sort of looking for the main, always looking for the main chance. And he's a kind of sad, thwarted character who moves into a pub called the Wild Man, meets the landlady Doll, who he fancies, and sort of gets his foot under the table, and even more than that. But he develops an ambition to actually marry her and to become the landlord. And I won't say too much in case anyone because no one wants to read it. But it kind of doesn't work, to put it mildly. So that's one of the main characters. The other is Clementine, who's a middle-class girl who is at the beginning of the war is engaged to be married to a doctor, all very safe and staid. Her brother is killed early on in the war, and partly the grief of that and partly as an escape from the inevitability of her projected life, decides to go join up as a VAD, and she goes to she ends up in France at the front, working in a field hospital. Is shocked out of her skin at what she meets there. But she also falls in love and loses someone very dear to her, and has another awful traumatic experience. And so after the war, she is flawless. She's a beautiful, flawless middle-class woman who does marry her doctor. So really, I think people say to her in the book several times that she's fallen on her feet. She's safe. But there's something damaged about her and something missing. And when she encounters Vincent, who is very clearly damaged, he has a prosthetic, part of his face is prosthetic because of the awful and very common facial disfigurement caused by someone putting their head over the trench and getting hit. There's something that she's really drawn to his physical trauma, as it seems to match something in her and the way that she seems to have gone through all that and come back scot-free in a sense. His damage is very attractive to her, not particularly in a romantic way, but she's very drawn to him. And it's their entanglement that leads to the main plot of the book, once it gets going.
You were talking about kind of having done the research for this book, and also that you're researching for the sequel, which I'd seen people have been discussing on Twitter as well. In case you didn't already know, that people seem to be getting quite interested and excited about that. What types of things? What type of research do you undergo before embarking on something like this? I mean, what types of things do you end up reading or looking at? Was there anything that particularly kind of resonated or moved you or spoke to you in some way, shape or form?
Well, as I say, I'm slightly embarrassed in front of academic historians to...
No. And that's almost the point, because I think that, the idea is, did you read the right stuff or the wrong stuff, is actually a really dull question to me. I think, what did you read that spoke to you in some way, I think is a much more interesting kind of approach to how people undergo reading and research and the like. So, what were the things that you read that you really excited you or you found super interesting?
I read quite a lot of anthologies of soldiers, and a book which I'm just looking at the moment called Women in the War Zone by Anne Powell. I don't know if you know that. That's a collection of first-hand experience of women who were in the war zone. I mean, there's some very beautiful, powerful writing in there that really helped me with thinking about Clementine's experience. I went to the Imperial War Museum and read some diaries and letters and so on, which were helpful too, and some novels. Return of the Soldier, Rebecca West.
It's a favourite of mine.
So you're ticking all of Jessica's boxes now.
Oh, absolutely.
Aldous Huxley, Rosamund Lehman, Virginia Woolf, Madox Ford's big war.
Parade's End,
yeah.
Yes,
yeah. So all of those, and I think as much for the language and the atmosphere, that's what I find what I really like to do when I'm researching is not read so much about the time, but read the time by reading things that were produced. Having said that, I did find one of the adaptations of an Agatha Christie on the television incredibly useful in terms of clothes and it was I can't remember what it was called, but it was very helpful to me in the scenes when Vincent is meeting his grief in his prison cell. And
was that was the Sarah Phelps witness for the prosecution, I'm guessing?
Probably was, yeah.
Yeah, because that was one with the very weird scene right at the end where they're walking across no man's land for no apparent plot reason that I could work out. But yeah, I can see how the legal scenes.
It was fantastic, and because really, I mean, someone else has done the research for me there.
Yeah.
Which is lazy, perhaps, but I think it's quite. unexpected what it is that will. And I watch that I quite often watch something that happens to be set in the same time with a notebook and pen, and I hardly ever write anything down, forgetting about it. I was actually recording that, and I was scribbling away and and that really did help tremendously. So you never quite know what it's going to be that's going to be the thing. But Women in the War Zone, as I say, by Anne Powell, it has some really powerful first-hand experiences, and some of it is very beautifully written. There's May Sinclair, I don't know if you know May Sinclair, who was a writer at the time, did some supposedly annotating or transcribing experiences. I think she must have been doing more than transcribing, because they all come out so beautifully, literary, but very, very powerful stuff. So I suppose I would say books, museums. I had no personal, apart from a few family photos, nothing sort of personal for this one. For the next one, I actually have a box that I've been looking through this morning, which I find very powerful, of letters and photographs, and like my dad's old army service book with his will written out in the back, in case it all went wrong for him, and some documents, some artifacts about my aunt, his sister, who was killed in the war, and it was when she was killed in the Blitz that he signed up and went. So it's all very sad and powerful. But and I have to say, actually holding those pieces of paper that were really, they're not, nobody has published them or seen them before, and they almost smell of the war. They're kind of very grainy and that sort of soft paper, and some things written in pencil that you can barely make out. And very unworthy preoccupations. Most of my dad's left at home worrying about how much money would be for him when he got back. To spend his pay.
As someone who spent a lot of time reading soldiers' letters, the amount of time they spend thinking about food is extraordinary. Young men perpetually hungry, I think, is what soldiers' letters really reflect.
How much different cigarettes are.
Yeah.
I wonder if you said you rewrote when you revisited it, you rewrote some of it. I wonder how difficult it is when you're looking at the First World War to sort of, I don't know, do you avoid cliches, or do you sometimes welcome them with open arms as a sort of a shortcut for getting something across?
Unfortunately, any big event becomes like a cluster of cliches, really. It's very hard to get in between. And I was aware at some points that I perhaps was falling into the trap of not quite escaping them. But at the same time, it is a kind of shorthand. And the cliches are cliches for good reason, usually, because they have a truth in them. Yeah, I mean, I think what I was saying earlier about when I was writing about Clementine getting engaged before the war, and then her fiancé being killed, that felt to me like a cliche. But as well as being a cliche, it was a tragic, real story for so many people. I think the trick, I suppose, is rather than think of it as a cliche and leave it as a cliche, is to kind of peel back and find that truth in it and find the freshness.
I have to say, I think, let's say perhaps with Clementine's relationships, but your choice of Vincent's disability, I mean, as you say, facial injuries were not uncommon, but my own work at the moment is on disabled ex-servicemen, and relatively speaking, there are fewer facial injuries than there were amputations. Amputation is a lot more common, and yet your choice and Blasted Things reminded me in a good way of Louisa Young's My Dear, I Have Something to Tell You, which also uses facial injury very effectively. I've said elsewhere that I think facial injury has become, in the centenary period, something of the symbolic wound of the war, this very visible memory of the war. One of the things I enjoyed about the book was the fact that it took what could become a cliche, and I think in Louisa Young's not the only one who's used it. In lesser hands, it has become a cliche, but made it something that really has an authentic reflection of what it must have been like to live with one of those tin masks with the eye, almost to the point where there are moments where you don't, it's so much a part of who Vincent is and who the character of Vincent is that you forget that he has it. It's not sort of, I didn't see it in my mind's eye every time Vincent appeared. He was a much more rounded character than his facial injury.
Well, I wanted it to be like, and I wanted it almost to be that he almost forgot about it. So that, for instance, when they have their little holiday, negotiating holiday in Bolton-on-the-Naze, the woman in the fish and chip shop clearly notices it. And it really shocks him because he's kind of thinking he's there on a little holiday with his, and everyone else will think it's his wife and child and things. And that kind of, that's the beginning of the breaking of that, the mood for him. He doesn't look at himself in the mirror apart from with it on. I was pleased with, I suppose, in as much as I ever am pleased with anything, that the way the getting underneath the mask, and that she managed to see his face, and she managed to see a tear oozing up out of a tear duct where there's no eye, which was kind of almost beautiful as well as horrifying.
Yeah,
an edge that I quite often like to play around with when I'm writing.
Because the cliche that often comes out in such things like that is that, the person they're a tin mask with a person attached to it, whereas Vincent is a person who has a tin mask, and there's an important difference. And I like the fact that he still has that kind of well-rounded chancer characteristic about him.
Oh, good. I mean, quite often people with tin masks are actually really good.
Yeah.
Underneath, I mean, they're just and in fiction, quite often I've noticed that people with injuries, they've got hearts of gold and they're wonderful people, and you have to try and see past the injury, but actually he's not.
Yes,
he is the man he would have been, only a little bit more extreme, I think, because of he has to overcome his massive disappointments in life, and I think that's one of the aftermaths of war. I don't know where, particularly the First World War, was just a sense of this huge disappointment and letdown, and on a personal and a national level, everything became so poor afterwards, didn't it? And even the weather was horrible, and then the Spanish flu. Oh, incidentally, I'm very cross I didn't get the Spanish flu in. I was going to, and then I thought about this cliche thing. Oh, if somebody dies of Spanish flu, it's just so I didn't. But I wish I had.
I thought you were hinting at. Isn't there one scene where I'm forgetting Clementine's husband's name now? Dennis. Yes. I thought there was one scene where he's talking about how busy he is, where I thought you were hinting at it slightly, because as a doctor, of course, he would have been in the front line, and he's a lovely rounded character as well in all his pomposity, but he's not awful and pompous the whole time. He's quite sweet and in some scenes, and you can see exactly why Clementine not only marries him but remains married to him, even as he can be horribly patronizing upon occasion.
That's one of the things I found so interesting about reading fiction at the time, and that is how men did speak to women, calling them little girl and good little girl and all this that makes you cringe now, but it's absolutely how it was. I think Dennis is an interesting character because he didn't, he was a doctor, he didn't need to go and fight, and he didn't, and that's a perfectly pragmatic choice of his. And some doctors had to stay at home and be doctors anyway. So I mean, it wasn't. I think there was always that kind of edgy feeling between people who had been and people who hadn't been.
Yeah, this is a bit of a area of specialism for me because I've just actually written a book about the Royal Army Medical Corps, including a little bit about doctors. I was more interested in the men of the ranks of the Corps. If you read Ian Whitehead's book, Doctors in the Great War, you get the impression there was quite a lot of pressure on doctors to volunteer for the RAMC, particularly in the early years. So it must have taken a certain amount of strength of character to say no to that pressure.
And of course, he didn't want Clem to go either, and partly because he didn't think that she was strong enough. So actually, he had to go and prove that she was. Although whether she was is a debatable point.
I was thinking about kind of the wider characters, and I've had that thing where I started a sentence where I knew I could remember exactly the characters I was about to talk about, and now their names have gone out of my head. It's Clementine's friends and sister-in-law, about some of the
her friend
Yes.
And Harry's sister-in-law, yeah.
Stuff that is effectively regarding sexuality, which is both hinted at and also left pleasingly unspoken, going on in the background, which at times kind of summoned up in my mind a touch of everyone living at Charleston, kind of painting in triangles and loving in circles or something along those lines, of this kind of acknowledged fact that they are lesbians and they exist, but also, well, if we just don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. And isn't it very strange? And they shouldn't live in that cottage by themselves. And I thought that as a kind of an intriguing little subplot that you sometimes just got a little snapshot through Clementine's eyes at was really nice.
Yeah, I'm interested in that. I mean, Sarah Hall has written. I mean, not Sarah Hall. Sarah Waters has written so much of her historical fiction with a gay subject, not even subplot, but subject, that I didn't want to make that a centre state. I didn't want that to be the centre of it. But I just liked the feeling that there are these different choices. People aren't all living the kind of life that Clementine's living, which is so conventional. I like Harry being a little bit, I don't know, like a proto-hippie almost. So I was wanting to well, it sounds very as if I was thinking about it in this way. I wasn't. I like the idea when I'm writing a novel of like filling in the spaces, so it's not all just a thin exploration of a certain subject or a thin queue of characters taking turns to take the limelight. But I like the sense of a crowd, and there are other people there with can take other attitudes to whatever is happening. And it almost offered Clementine another alternative. I mean, she's not gay, but I think she could probably have seen the attraction almost and she's quite conventional economically and socially, but she could almost sort of see the quaintness of Harriet's choices. So it's just giving her giving the reader a sense of the society as being a bit more interesting and nuanced than just one sort of set of attitudes.
It did remind me, I've been reading a lot during lockdown. I've been reading a lot of interwar middlebrow women's writing. The two it made me think of, I've just read Dorothy Whipple's High Wages, which was wonderful, but actually the one it made me think of was Winifred Holtby's, and I'm going to get the title wrong because it wasn't South Riding. I'm going to have to think about it. But the point is that what Holtby does, and I think she does it in all her novels actually, is use a character, a central character, to then explore these very dense, complex small town communities. And I think that's what you've done in this book as well. There was a real sense of place here, which I loved. And from sort of the physical space of the pub out to the social relationships in the community. And I think this novel really captured that sort of, which is very common of interwar middlebrow fiction, which is one of the reasons I really enjoyed it. It felt very familiar and of the time which it was trying to represent.
It's interesting that you mentioned Winifred Holtby, because of course one of the other books I read, which was really influential, was Vera Britton's Testament of Youth. I found that very helpful for all those kind of domestic details, as well as for the awful, her tragic story, which you could say is a cliched story. This is the trouble, isn't it? She lost her fiance, she lost her brother, she lost her father, I think, or someone else important to her anyway. A lot of the things she went through, reading from now, do seem like a cliche, but of course, when they weren't at the time.
They were the original, I think.
Yeah.
I wonder how much you wrestled with Vincent as his disability, insofar as it just got me thinking that often the war casualty in fiction can be almost like a red herring character, that you lead them down a path, they turn, and they're all set up to be the villain, and then perhaps they're not. And I was just thinking about Vincent. Did you? And I'm not sure why people do it. I think it's because people don't want to sort of say, oh, he's been damaged, and so he's not really a villain. He's a saint, and perhaps that's part of the fiction of earlier fiction, that you don't point a finger at the war casualty and they turn out to be a wrong un, as it were. I wonder if you wrestled with that with Vincent at all.
No. As I said, and this sometimes happens when I'm writing. Some characters are just like spring almost fully formed onto the page, and it was more a process of exploring and finding out about him than making him up. Yeah, and I was very sad that he had to meet the fate that he met, but it seemed to me to make utter sense for him, and almost be a rounding off of something. There was nothing for him really, poor Vincent. And I suppose in narrative terms, I always knew that one of these two characters was going to come to a sticky end, and that's partly about, I suppose, that's about narrative balance and structure. But it was also just a sense of the truth of it, that's what happened. People didn't just die in the war; they died because of the war later on, which I'm just been finding out today actually about so many prisoners of war. Afterwards committed suicide or died of other diseases, and so that's the darkness that leads forward. One thing I would like to ask, if any of you know about this, maybe Jessica does, is the differences in the public and governmental perceptions of suffering, of trauma after the First World War and after the Second World War. If you can identify a real difference.
Well, it's interesting. I know a lot less about after the Second World War, but the Ministry of Pensions, which is the institution that I'm really looking at the moment, there is an acknowledgement of suffering. Part of the role of the Ministry of Pensions is to attempt to give that a sort of financial basis. What is the pension for a particular type of wound? And one of the debates that I and colleagues who work in the same field have been really engaging in, there's this schedule of wounds. So you can get 100% pension for actually facial injury was almost always 100% pension, or if you were blinded, multiple amputations. And then it went down a scale of 90%, 80%, 70% down to 20%, which was a one-off payment. And the percentage defined how much money you got a week of a pension. The schedule itself is set out in terms of physical injury, but there are ways in which it acknowledges both social stigmas that attach to particular injuries and psychological wounds are incorporated into this schema and cause all sorts of interesting debates and discussions. And I've actually got a student who's about to submit her PhD on facial injury and psychological trauma, and the men who engaged with the ministry. It's such a good thesis. So there is a political acknowledgement of suffering. There is also the politics of finance. So in the early 1920s, there's then a row between the Ministry of Pensions on the one hand and the Treasury on the other, with the ministry attempting to actually be more generous than popular memory has, and the Treasury wanting to save money essentially, and demanding that the ministry is a lot less generous towards men, because a lot of the diagnoses are much more subjective than bureaucrats would like. So there's certainly, after the war, at least a stated political desire to acknowledge trauma and wounds and ongoing suffering, less so for the families, although there are dependence allowances which go along with pensions because they're attempting to support men as the breadwinner. Sorry, this is getting into about 15 years worth of my research here. I could probably go on for much longer than you want me to. The bit I know best is that they expand the category of war widow in the Second World War, so that women whose husbands die from wounds or illnesses attributable to the war after the war ends are entitled to claim a widow's pension after the Second World War, which doesn't apply to women after the First World War, and creates all sorts of interesting complications. And a whole lot of women who, after this changes, the statute changes in 1939, a whole lot of widows from the First World War write in and say, I'd like to claim my widow's pension because my husband died within 10 years of the First World War and received his injury. And the ministry's writing back and saying, this only applies to men who enlisted after 1939. So there's a long history of limiting payments to families.
So that's kind of the financial side of it. I was thinking more of the way that now, when somebody has a traumatic experience, we actually, well, it's been identified as PTSD now, which of course it wasn't. That's only been identified as that lately, but how much that was acknowledged.
Men are entitled to treatment if they have a pension. So, and that can include treatment for psychological disabilities where diagnosed. But diagnosis is very complicated, and what, PTSD, which is a medico-legal term that develops in the 1980s out of the Vietnam War, there are a lot of things that would have been classified, that we would probably classify as psychological traumas of war, which don't come under the rubric of PTSD in strict medico-legal terms. And certainly it's a lot more fluid in the interwar period. The interesting thing, I think, going back to Vincent, is the extent to which, and this is something that I'm interested in researching a bit further myself, the extent to which physical wounds are understood to have psychological consequences in and of themselves. And Wendy Gagan's written a really good paper on using the letters of a man who lost his arm, which is about his process of coming to terms with that physical loss. So it's not just the physical wound and all the implications of not being able to tie his shoelaces or cut up his food anymore. There's also the sense of being less himself. And he had a fiancée, and at one point in the midst of depression, he writes to her and essentially tries to release her from the engagement because he doesn't think he can be the husband to her that he wants to be, which has become its own cliche. She refuses to be released, incidentally. I think they go on to get married. He ended up going into the Church of England and becoming a bishop somewhere. That complex relationship between physical injury and psychological injury. I was interested in the psychological characterization of Vince because my impression of him was there was less trauma around the injury per se than that sense of not getting his social due after the war. That scene where he loses his job in some ways has a much greater psychological impact on him than the wound itself or any period of time he spent in hospital. And that I thought was quite an interesting take on his character.
Yeah, I'm just interested very much in that sense of that. If we think about the well, I keep using the word trauma, but that's the word for it, that so many people went through, so the whole society went through in the First World War. And then really the ethos afterwards was much more, put your best foot forward, put your skeletons in the cupboard, stop thinking about, that. And how much that must have meant people were internalizing this terrible stuff. I'm interested in that because of what happened at the end of the Second World War, particularly when the Far East prisons of war came back, and I've only just discovered my dad never spoke, and he never spoke at all about his experiences. He was just a rather difficult, brooding man. And one of the things that interested me was that we never, there were 4 of us, 4 children and my mum, and we never asked him about it. It was just something that you didn't speak about. And that was nobody told us we couldn't speak about it, but it was just internalized. But I was just reading something this morning or yesterday that was saying, and I didn't know this before, that actually when those prisoners were coming home, the survivors, they were told not to speak about it because it would be too upsetting. And not only that, the families were told not to ask them about it. Yeah. So that kind of compounded, it must have compounded something awful, that it seemed as if the family weren't interested because they weren't asking.
I'd have to get back and look. Ollie Wilkinson's written a really good book on prisoners of war in the First World War, whether they were given the same message. The trope that men didn't speak about the war afterwards, retain this stiff upper lip, has actually, that is something that's been challenged by historians quite a lot recently, myself included. But Joel Morley's written a really interesting paper on First World War ex-servicemen and their relationship with men who then went on to serve in the Second World War. So who were men and relationships with younger men, boys, growing up in the interwar period. And one of the points that he makes is that even if fathers and sons didn't necessarily talk directly, sometimes, quite often, in fact, there were relationships between older men and younger protégés, whether it was an apprentice-master relationship or an uncle, where it was seen as more suitable for those stories to be told. And actually there was a lot more of passing on of experience, of telling of experience of the First World War between the generations than we perhaps think. But the family wasn't necessarily seen as the appropriate conduit. In my own writing, what I've argued is that very often men would tell wives or mothers things that they wouldn't then tell their children, or they'd tell wives things that they wouldn't tell their parents. So that's
so interesting, because my dad never spoke to any of us about it at all. We never, as I say, never asked him to. But after he died, and I was writing the book Easy Peasy, which was some years ago now, I went to visit someone who he had been he was on the Burma-Siam Railway, and someone who he was with, and the only person I knew to go and see who was still alive, and had gone the opposite way to my dad in that he was obsessed with it. He had a whole room full of every single magazine, every single picture of his newspaper reporters. It was terrifying. When I was with his wife in the kitchen and she was making tea, she told me something that my dad had told her, which was an awful story, when he had cerebral dysentery and he was declared dead, and he was put on a pile of bodies, and then he woke up. And she said he told it almost like it was a joke to her, but that's not something that he'd ever in a million years would have said to us.
One of his children,
So that kind of ties in very much. And in fact, in that book, I had the character who was like my dad confide in another woman. It's almost like they're not wanting to dirty the family by spilling out all this horror into the family setting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I certainly think you see a lot of that after the First World War as well. But Michael Roper's written about men who are almost, as you say, almost obsessed with remembering, with retelling their own story. This is the most extraordinary 4.5 years of their life, and they tell and retell it. But who they tell it to isn't necessarily who we assume they're going to tell it to. And in a way that reflects what happens with Vince. All his frustration gets focused in a very unexpected avenue in some ways. I found his way of addressing his obsession, it rang true with the character, but it wasn't what I would have imagined someone, that plot that he comes up with. It does ring true, but it is extraordinary.
I was writing that, I just felt this, but he just felt like he would have done that, and it was just his ingenuity, his rather warped kind of ingenuity at play there.
And in fact, that whole storyline becomes about, an element of tell your stories that you can't tell your family to me. Do you want to talk about your war stories that you can't tell your husband, you can't tell your family, you can't tell your children? Come and tell them to me. Now, obviously, he doesn't care about her war stories, even in the slightest. But it's a very interesting aspect.
But that's one of the interesting aspects of writing fiction about something which, we were always, when we're writing fiction, we're writing about things that are really there, unless we're writing utter fantasy. And even then, as some of your podcasts will show, that it still relates to real life and real events. But it's like setting off a series of events, a couple of characters with these packed, difficult backgrounds It's like winding them up and putting them into a little thing to see what happens. And so I didn't expect all of the things that happened in the book to happen at all, but it did feel like an honest playing out of the emotional truths that I was trying to root within them. And I suppose that's the same always, whatever I'm writing about, but it did take me in a slightly unexpected way in this book.
I suppose why you're here on this podcast is the particular challenge that comes with setting it in a specific historical moment. I'd say it's successful in capturing that moment and these people as, truthful human beings, real human beings in that moment. I don't know, Chris and Angus, do you have thoughts on that?
I'd agree. It felt like what parts of the 1920s feel like in my head, and it felt like a world populated by human beings, actual human beings who would act in ways that were normal to their characters, that would seem strange, or they'd come up with schemes and the like, but none of it ever felt cliched particularly or tropey. We've spoken previously on this podcast about people who, whilst lived through the war or experienced it in some way, and it might have had dramatic impacts both physically and psychologically on them, it didn't necessarily override every aspect of their character. And I think that's what I see in Vincent. He is the same guy after the war that he almost certainly was before it, but his opportunities for being Vincent have changed in fairly dramatic ways because of the war.
Interesting way of putting it. Yep.
So you describe him as a chancer. I sort of saw him as being optimistic, which is another way of putting it. He's completely baffled why he couldn't have his old job back, and that's because his employer saw him as, physically saw him, as opposed to necessarily he's the same person. He just looks a bit different. Vince's baffled by that. Optimistic.
But he is a chancer, I think, in the sense that when he bumps into Clementine, then he sees, and here's a chance here. He's obviously well healed, and when I say the phrase "well healed," that's just one of the things I suppose I was really hoping to get right, was the register of their voices and their language, because I think that is so important, and that's why I like to read. I prefer to surround myself really with stuff from the time rather than stuff about the time.
Well, as we've closed upon on an hour, it soon whizzes by, doesn't it? What do we talk about next time, Chris? There's the question we always ask you, and then we go,
I'm not sure. I think possibly it's going to be Holly Nielsen talking to us about board games during the First World War.
Or are we doing our Christmas special?
So I suppose it's a question, do we want to do 2 in December? Do we want to have a normal one and a Christmas special? Which, by the way, I think we should call Ho Ho Ho, What a Lovely Podcast. Or if we just launch straight into our Christmas special about the portrayal of the Christmas truce. I don't know, Angus.
There'll be something in December. We're not quite sure what yet.
Well, I guess we'll see what we. It'll be a surprise to all of us. Well, thank you for your time, Lesley. It was wonderful, as I say. Blasted things. We all thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It is available for buying through various bookshops and the like now, isn't it? 'Cause obviously we got these shiny advanced reading copies, but our listeners can go out and purchase it, presumably now, I would suspect.
That's right.
May 7th of May. We're behind the curve.
We'll put a link up.
We will. Well, thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.